So as we begin looking at chapter 6, we've transitioned away from looking at just public speaking communication, and we're going to look at some other aspects with communication, both in chapter 6 and chapter 8. Chapter 6 deals with interpersonal communication, and then chapter 8 will deal with cultural communication. So to begin with, chapter 6 goes through a variety of things regarding interpersonal communication. I'm just going to highlight some of those here. In the first section, it starts off by defining interpersonal communication. Remember, interpersonal communication is anything that occurs between two or more people whose lives are interdependent and mutually influence one another. So for example, talking to a cashier as you exchange, as you buy items and exchange money is not an interpersonal exchange unless it was someone that you knew from another context, like a friend or a relative or a coworker. Typically, we see interpersonal communication occur in academic settings, professional settings, personal settings, and civic settings. One of the things that your book points out is how interpersonal communication competence, so how well you do that, can improve our physical and psychological health, can improve relationships, and can make people more successful in the workplace. So if you're able to connect with others, that it helps in getting promotions and helps in getting hired. Some functions of interpersonal communication is that they help us identify instrumental goals. So when you're trying to achieve a goal or get help with something, it may be, can you help me move this weekend, or can you help me accomplish this task at work? Obviously, it helps with relationship goals. So we identify relationship needs if we need to be close to someone. It helps us identify ways to manage conflict, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later in the chapter. And then also self-presentation goals. So how I present myself and talk about myself are ways that we have interpersonal communication. We've talked about a little bit in an overview in chapter 1 about cultures, and usually we see cultures as very big picture, but there are also relationship cultures. So how we connect to people is dependent on our culture, and each of our relationships can have a different culture behind them. One of the things that the chapter talks about is how that's often based on what are called relationship schema or schemata, and so we build our relationships based on past relationships with other people. And you can see this in a variety of ways. So there are some individuals, when they say things like, oh, I will never form social relationships with people that I work with, it may be because they had a negative experience in the past that's guiding that. Same thing with, who we friend or don't friend on different social media things can be influenced by our past experiences that are there. We use storytelling and personal idioms to create a similarity and bonding, and then we also establish relationship routines and rituals. So it may be that you and your family do the same thing every night, that you have dinner at a table and you talk about your day, or there may be a specific question you answer. That's a relationship routine. Rituals are more significant ways. So if you celebrate birthdays or holidays in specific ways, those are rituals that we talk about. So section 2 of chapter 6 talks about conflict and interpersonal communication. Some important takeaways here are that, remember, conflict is it's inevitable part of relationships. It's not always negative, and if dealt with effectively, can help the relationship grow because you learn how to communicate through those. Again, when we talk about interpersonal communication in relationships, certainly don't just identify that as romantic relationships. It's talking about friendships, talking about family relationships, and talking about close relationships that we may have with coworkers. Some different styles of conflict management are discussed in this section. Real quickly going through them, there's the competing style, avoiding conflict style, which people rely a lot on, accommodating, which means that you just do what the other person wants in the conflict situation, compromising, and then the last one that chapter 6 spends a lot of time on is collaboration, which is the one that if you can use it, you want to be able to use it effectively. Other things that deal with culture or with conflict, or that our culture influences how we manage conflict. So there are some families who manage conflict by talking about it, some that manage it by avoiding it, some that manage it by yelling. I mean, there are different ways that people handle conflict. And so a lot of the ways that we handle conflict come from or derive from how we grew up and saw other people around us deal with that kind of conflict. There are some common conflict triggers that it's important to be aware of. If you can identify, what's causing the conflict, it's easier to get to the root to it. They're very common sense. So criticism, demands, and rejection are all that are very common. The last one is cumulative annoyance. So just somebody doing things over and over and over again that annoy you over time. Section 6.3 talks about emotions and interpersonal communication. Remember, we learn to display our emotions through socialization and how we were brought up. So if you were brought up in a family that always displayed their emotions, that's probably how you display emotions. If you were brought up in a family that did not display emotions at all, that is also true. And so our expressions of emotions are influenced by social norms and display rules. And remember, those are also guided by culture. So it may be culturally acceptable to cry in this situation in Western cultures where it isn't in Eastern cultures. One of the interesting things in this section is it talks about different types of attachment styles. As you're reading the book, you'll notice that I've put an attachment style quiz in there. I would encourage you to take it and look at the different attachment styles that are there. It really does help offer some insight into how we relate to people and how people relate to us. And then finally, developing emotional vocabulary can be helpful in meaningfully expressing emotions and communicating our emotions to others. And then the last part of chapter 6 talks about self-disclosure and interpersonal communication. There's a lot of rich information here. I would really encourage you to read it. For right now, I just want to go over 3 different theories that deal with how we self-disclose. So remember, self-disclosure is just information, personal information that we choose to disclose to another person. You've probably been in situations where somebody over discloses information or self-discloses information in situations that it isn't appropriate, whether that be in a job interview or wait staff at a restaurant. Any of those types of situations, you've probably seen some over disclosure that are there. So 3 theories that kind of guide how people typically self-disclose are the social penetration theory, social comparison theory, and the Johari window. So the social penetration theory just says, as we get to know someone, we disclose more information. So the further we go in that relationship, the more information we disclose. The book talks about an example of that is an onion, like you've heard about in Shrek, where you peel away layers and see different parts. Social comparison theory says we compare ourselves to others, and so through that, we disclose information to see if we're similar or dissimilar from the individual we're talking to. And then the last one is the Johari window, which helps us understand different parts of ourselves. The Johari window argues that there are 4 windows of information: open, hidden, blind, and unknown. So open information is information that I know and the person that I'm talking to is aware of. Hidden information is information that I know about myself that I don't disclose to the person I'm talking to. Blind information is information I may not know about myself that they know. So for example, if it looks like I'm really upset when I'm talking, I may not be aware of that, but the person that we're interacting with might. And then unknown information is information that neither of us knows. So that's just a real quick overview of chapter 6. Interpersonal communication has a lot more information about it than we have time to discuss. Again, I would strongly encourage you to make sure you aren't using these videos as an attempt to replace your reading of the chapter. They're just highlighting some important things and concepts as you're going forward. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Thanks.